Welcome to the LIVEcast, everybody.
Hello, good to see you all again.
Here we are. I'm Glenn Scrivener.
I'm Paul Feasy.
And here we are in our studio space, which
Yeah.
is developing by the week.
It's all looking a bit new and shiny, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah. And another thing that's new, it's Monday. It is not Tuesday.
That's
Yeah.
true. That's true. Yes, it is Monday.
This is the top news item
You are
for
right.
today.
In other news, it's Monday.
And it's 2 p.m, not 1 p.m.
Yeah.
Let us know what you think about our change of time.
Bit of a different time, but yes, hopefully you like all this. Our interns have been working very hard to make this place look great, and I hope you agree, it does look great. So we're still going to be, I think, working on it a bit more, doing some other bits, aren't we, as we find our way around the studio, but it's all coming together. So
working on the sound, working on the
very
video,
pleased.
we are getting there. This week on the LIVEcast, we're going to talk about Thomas Cook going bust, #1 story on BBC and everywhere else. We're going to talk about FIFA enforcing gender equality on Iran. What do we think about that? We're going to think about Richard Dawkins and his new book called Outgrowing God, but have we actually outgrown Richard Dawkins? And then we're going to think with one of our new interns, Pete Collison, about the key to finding your purpose. But first of all, Thomas Cook shuts down and 150,000 people are stranded. What's the story, Paul?
Sure, Thomas Cook. So, I mean, if you're in the UK, you probably know exactly what we're talking about. If you're not UK-based, Thomas Cook is a holiday travel company. It's been running for, 178 years?
Yeah, since 1841.
1841.
Yes.
And it's recently, well, as of today, or late last night, it's gone into liquidation. And so it's been in the news in the last few days. They were looking for a bailout, see whether someone could buy the company or shore them up a bit. And particularly they were looking to the government, the UK government, for £150 million, which the government refused them. And then it emerged today that they were going into liquidation. So 150,000 people have been stranded around the globe, Europe, presumably.
Mainly Europe.
Mostly Europe, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the headline should be, like, Britain's trying to exit Europe in a meltdown and looking to the government to solve that problem. I don't, if you want to exit Europe, I'm not sure the government is really...
No, their track record isn't excellent at the moment, is it? On
It'll take 3 years to get
extracting.
them back, at least.
Yeah. So,
Juncker is holding them in a basement somewhere, demanding a ransom payment, no doubt.
So they were looking for £150 million from the UK government. The UK government said no, they weren't going to do that. And it just, as I was hearing this thing, when I was looking at the news story about whether they were going to bail them out or not, the thing that struck me initially is I just sat there and I thought, well, no, they shouldn't bail them out. Of course they shouldn't. This is a private company who have, through whatever reasons, they've mismanaged their finances in some way, shape or form. And now they're going under. I don't see why the taxpayer should step in. I mean, because, if my company goes under...
You're on your own, buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'd love the government to give me £150 million. I'm seriously considering an
Is that
application.
how much you're worth?
No, but it's worth a try, right?
Self-employed. Salary.
But I thought surely no, they shouldn't do that. And the question or the kind of phrase that went through my head was, how do I feel about people being bailed out when they don't deserve it?
Right.
And then I was just painfully aware of the irony, really, of myself as a Christian feeling that way about a company.
That's our story.
Because that is the Christian story, being bailed out when we certainly don't deserve it at all.
Yes. And a higher power steps in, pays off your debt.
Absolutely.
Helps you to go free.
And we completely don't deserve it.
Yeah. That's the good news, right?
That is the good news. But then the question is, well, surely if I've been forgiven in that way, I've been... my debt has been paid, whatever. I've been bailed out in that sense.
Redeemed.
Yeah. How much more so should I show that to others? The question then was, where does that end? Does it extend to a company like Thomas Cook?
Yes.
And I can understand people saying, oh, well, they should be bailed out because think of all the people stranded. But from what I've heard, no one is really going to be stranded.
No.
They're all getting back. It's all
They're
being
all
paid.
atoll protected.
It will all be paid for. The civil aviation authorities stepped in, and that money.
And if they
comes
have
from
to spend an
airlines.
extra week in Mallorca, nobody's
Well,
crying.
I did see a wonderful picture on Twitter of someone saying, like, emergency, we're stranded, this is really hard. And they're just sitting around the pool, like, going, like, oh, this is terrible. Like,
a particularly British crisis.
Yeah. But, people should be covered by the protections.
They'll be covered.
At least the EU protections.
But does the gospel mean... Are you saying that the gospel entails that we bail out every unworthy, incompetent? Is that... It can't mean that, can it?
Well, surely that's the thing, isn't it? Like, how far do we extend... Do we extend this? And I think actually to people, because you could be as a non-Christian, you could look at the Christian view of people being bailed out when they don't deserve it, and just say,
Right.
well, that's ridiculous.
Right.
And that's you can understand that.
And Jesus kind of exacerbates that. You know, he tells the story of the workers in the vineyards, and there's the workers who start at like 9 in the morning, and they
Yep.
bear the heat of the day and the burden of the work, and they're paid 1 denarius, and then the Johnny-come-latelys, there they are. At like 5 p.m. they clock on, and they get the same, a denarius, and it's not fair. And Jesus taps into the fact that if we're in the financial world, if we're speaking economically, that's just totally unfair, and we realize that's wrong. But Jesus is like, yeah, that's how the gospel works, though.
Yeah.
The gospel totally. We're all Johnny-come-latelys, and we're all like bailed out in this lavish way. So why should we not bail out? Well, I guess you've got to kind of distinguish between church and state, and you got to distinguish between how things operate at a state level, at a governmental level, at a market level, and how things operate in the family and in the church and those kinds of things. Because like we already realize that the family operates economically very differently to the market. You know.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
my family operates as a communist state. Like totally is.
Yeah.
You know, from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs.
I can honestly say my children are contributing nothing towards
a drain.
my family. Like.
They're a drain on the Feezy purse.
Just,
And they are told that every morning.
on the benefit system of the Feezy household. That's what it is.
The
Like.
bread line every morning, queuing up. Please, Daddy, can I have some more? And then you teach them to pick a pocket or
Yeah,
two.
I've removed all their means of labour anyway, so they're now mine.
So yeah, the family works in a very different way to the way the market operates. You know, and like at a state level, where you know, if you are traveling with Thomas Cook to another country, you probably look up like whether that country has a rule of law, like because you think a state ought to operate with a rule of law in which justice is the bottom line. And I'm not expecting mercy from politicians. I'm not expecting mercy from the police force. I'm not expecting mercy from judges. Whereas, so the state should have a rule of law. The family, like if you come from a family and the first thing you say about your family is there was a rule of law, you probably need counselling. Probably a lot of expensive therapy that ought to be coming your way. Like there ought to be a law of love and mercy and bailouts. Like you should bail out your kid if they get problems, right?
Yeah.
Probably. Although if they're a drug addict, maybe giving them £50,000 is
not a helpful thing.
Is the fast track to them killing themselves.
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
So even there you got to draw lines around it, but it's different. You know, we don't bail everybody out. There's a law of love and there's a law of kind of justice, and those two things aren't the same, really.
Yeah. So.
Did you look into Thomas Cook's history at all?
Yeah, it was quite surprising actually. So, so Thomas Cook, turned out he was a former Baptist preacher.
Yeah.
So actually a very religious man, and his whole thing, kind of in the 1800s, he believed that all the ills of Victorian society were caused by drinking, and so he was big on the temperance movement. And actually, his first kind of packages that he started doing were trips for the temperance movement. And so his first one was a trip from Leicester to Loughborough.
Yeah.
It's a 12-mile journey, and in the price you got your ticket and you got your lunch or your food.
All inclusive.
All inclusive. But we were just laughing because we thought, you know, how funny it was that here was a guy who said all of the ills of society have been caused by drinking, the temperance movement, and now through his company, or at least until recently, you could have, of course, booked an all-inclusive package to Marbella where you could get a margarita at 9 a.m. in your package, you know, just...
So there's been some mission
drift, I think, is what you call that. Definitely.
That sounds good. But it is interesting when you think about 1841. So this is right when Wesley and Whitefield were getting going, right before the evangelical revivals, and you know, I read so George Whitefield's biography written by Arnold Dallimore. He talks about in like 1837 or sometime around then, that literally there was only like 6 people who took communion on Easter Sunday at St. Paul's Cathedral. Like we tend to think that, you know, the church has always been strong and it's just been this
gradual decline.
But actually 1 in 4 houses in London in the 1840s was a gin house. So you can understand how if someone is actually wanting to do Christian ministry, they probably like are into the temperance thing and they do this different thing. But right around the time that Thomas Cook is getting going, Wesley and Whitefield are getting going, so that by 1850, actually about 50% of the country is going to church. And so it's interesting that Thomas Cook was kind of a part of that. And actually, his business model was to take Sunday schools and take them on day trips. And from that, we've got, the modern world. And when you dig into where so much stuff has come from in the modern world, you actually see some really interesting Christian roots. Warren says on Facebook, unless you're a bank.
Yeah, so talking about bailing out there, and we've talked about this a bit before, saying, well, did we think the banks should be bailed out? And saying, I mean, obviously that's a nightmare anyway, but I think there is a difference between a worldwide banking crisis, recession with its knock-on effects, and the holiday company down the road.
Yeah.
Otherwise, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
And already, like I said, Thomas Cook Thompson have already jumped on the bandwagon, Thompson Holidays, and have started recruiting the Thomas Cook people. So I mean, I think these guys are going to recover.
Yes.
On the whole.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's the Thomas Cook story. Should they be bailed out? No. But
and they've not been.
Thank God. Yeah, and they haven't been.
It's not happened. So.
But thank God we have been. There we go.
Absolutely.
The other story, one of the other stories I wanted to think about today is FIFA has just come out and has insisted that Iran change a 40-year-long policy of excluding women from football stadiums. So ever since the Ayatollahs kind of took over from the Shah in 1979, women have not been allowed to watch men's football in those stadiums. And there was a very high-profile, very tragic case of a woman who dressed up as a man to try and get into the football. She was arrested, and then the next thing that she did was to set herself alight outside one of these stadiums, and she actually died from her injuries. Sahar Kodayari, known as Blue Girl, actually died on the 10th of September this year. And fascinating that, in a sense, her martyrdom has been something that's woken up the world to this issue of gender inequality in Iran. And now FIFA have come along and they have insisted that unless Iran allows women into its stadiums to watch these games, then they will have their World Cup status removed. So an interesting story here, because FIFA is doing something that all of us think should happen. Unless you're the Ayatollah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unless you're the Taliban, you think this is right. But it is this very Eurocentric organization that is imposing its views on a foreign culture.
Yeah.
And I wonder, how do we feel about that? What are the clashes that are occurring at the worldview level there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? So, I think we would all agree, wouldn't we? Probably those of us who are listening to this, that this is absolutely the right thing. That of course there should be that gender equality, that women should be able to go into the stadiums and watch the matches as the men do. But then there is that kind of flip side where you want to say, okay, but are you therefore saying that their culture is wrong? Because that is their culture and their belief. And actually, in the West, particularly the way things are going, people have been very uncomfortable saying, this is wrong and this is right. There's been a kind of, well, everybody's allowed to believe what they want to be and everyone's equal and valid. Your truth is your truth and so on. But here, that's kind of clashing a little bit. And we're saying, well, how, whilst we do agree that, certainly the women should be allowed into the stadium, for us as Christians, that's no problem.
Yeah.
Because we have an authority that we can look to, an objective standard we can say about from creation and, from Scripture, the equality of men and women. It's very hard to ground that in anything if you've thrown away all your objective standards in the West. And so, I think it's an interesting conversation to be having, with non-Christian friends to say, well, what do you think about the FIFA situation? Because they're likely to say that they think it's absolutely right what FIFA are doing. But then you can push down these roads and say, well, why do you think it's right? And do you think their culture is wrong? Do you think it's okay to say people's cultures are wrong? And I think there's some interesting discussions in there.
Especially because, what if women voted for it? Or, what if you go to Afghanistan and you ask women, do you think the Taliban are right about, for instance, not educating women and that sort of thing? And you might even get to the stage where democratically women vote for the Taliban and vote for that kind of regime. But still, we've got the very deep, strong sense that no matter where you're from, no matter what your culture, there is right and there is wrong, and gender equality is this kind of moral absolute that is not to be contradicted in any way, shape, or form. So we've got this equality of the sexes thing, which is a deeply Christian idea, and we've got this impulse that we want to be able to say that there are moral universals that transcend culture, which is a deeply Christian thing. But we've also got this postmodern thing that it's all relative, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. It's all relative. You're not allowed to question.
And it's cultural imperialism to try and force on another culture these Western values that are very specific.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's just the way this has all gone. So people have stripped away from the idea of gender equality, the idea its Christian roots, and they will criticize Christianity, and they will say often people will say it is a Western. It's a Western religion that's imposed itself on other cultures, which obviously is nonsense anyway. But here we have a Western organisation imposing its culture on another culture.
Yes. Yes.
And but can people just not see that?
Yeah, exactly. Emma Lawson says, "Is this not a human rights issue? Doesn't that transcend culture?" And it totally is. But where do we get our human rights from?
Yeah, human rights are not a given, are they?
They're not as universal as we might imagine.
No.
The Ayatollah does not sign up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
No.
You know.
So we would absolutely have no problem with it being a human right thing, would be. But if you don't agree with the basis of human rights,
yeah.
But then if you've stripped away an objective standard above you to give you any human rights, it's very difficult to argue that human rights are even a real thing with any foundation, apart from your preference.
Apart from your preference, or very interestingly. One of the spokespeople for FIFA, before this ruling came out, he said, "I very much hope that Iran change their mind on this because history will not judge them very well for this."
Yeah, the future won't.
The future. So when people in the future look back on Iran, they will realize how wrong Iran was. Well, that is to assume that the Islamic Caliphate doesn't dominate the world. Right. That is to assume that Iran does not go on, a spree of, world domination, and that is to deny that Islam might well hold sway in the future, and certainly Islam will probably have more adherents than secular humanism will.
Yeah,
it does right now.
And so who is to say that the future or history won't look kindly on liberal Western values?
Right.
But of course, there's this assumption that we are right. Mm-hmm. But if you'd say, well, what it comes down to, if you don't have any objective foundation outside of you, is simply, you say, why do you think gender equality is the right thing? And well, it's obvious.
Right.
When you say to the Iranian Ayatollah, why is it the case that women shouldn't be allowed into stadiums? Well, it's obvious. That's all it will come down to ultimately. If you have nothing outside of you apart from preferences.
Yeah. And we are going to interview Tom Holland very soon, actually. He's just written a wonderful book called Dominion about how the West has been made by Christian values, and very specifically Christian values. He's an historian who's written 6 books of popular history, and Dominion will go into, the idea of human rights is a profoundly Christian idea, actually. Which is not to say that it can't be held in common with secular humanist ideals, but those secular humanist ideals have roots, and those roots are totally biblical roots. So just a little thing that kind of helps you in your evangelism. I'm often talking about the Taliban, like do you think the Taliban are wrong? And I talk in those terms because people want to do the whole cultural relativism thing. And, mention female genital mutilation. There are a whole bunch of cultures, and everybody in that culture believes in female genital mutilation. Does that make it right or not? Is there something above democracy, above cultural preference that says what's right and wrong? And cases like FIFA versus Iran help you with that.
Absolutely.
Before we get another one of our interns to discuss with us why they have come to be an intern with the Foundry, something else that's in the news at the moment, he's got a book to flog, and flog it he will. Richard Dawkins, 13 years ago, Richard Dawkins released The God Delusion. And as a friend of mine often says about Richard Dawkins, he owes God a lot of money. That sophomoric entree into the world of philosophy and theology by Richard Dawkins did earn him millions and millions and millions of pounds, and he's back at it, writing a book called Outgrowing God, and this time he's aiming at a younger audience and trying to help them to outgrow God. But the reception to the book has been mixed, to say the least.
It certainly had. I mean, I was quite surprised he even had a new book out because, to my mind, Richard Dawkins, from an atheist point of view, had become pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of atheists had thrown him out because they weren't pleased with him, and we'd not heard of him for quite a while. And then suddenly this book appeared, and I was just taken by surprise he was actually still bothering.
Yes.
And I likened it earlier to the film Independence Day. You know, when Independence Day came out in like 1997, it was a big, huge thing.
It had its moment.
Yeah, you know, it was it's not aged well, but it was a great kind of thing, huge movie at the time. And then in 2017, 20 years later, they were like, we're doing a sequel, and we're like, oh,
yeah,
no one asked for this.
I didn't even know.
No one
doing a
cares.
sequel?
No, they did it. They've done it. Yeah,
really,
yeah, exactly. And you just kind of think, well, did we need this?
No.
No. And
they want to do Princess Bride. Have you heard that?
Yeah, remake it.
They want to remake Princess Bride.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of that.
Oh,
just, yeah. But yes, the reception hasn't been particularly good online, and particularly there's been a tweet by a Syriologist.
Yes.
Who has just basically already a few pages into Dawkins' book just gone, well, all this stuff he says is complete nonsense and just historical stuff.
Yes.
Conflating different things together, and he's saying, well, you're completely mixing up stories and ideas here that are not from the same historical places and sources. And that's been fascinating to kind of see. And I think, what did he say? He from what he could tell, Dawkins had compiled a lot of his information from a website called HistoryWiz, is it .com?
You've got to check out
which you need to go and have a look at. And it's fascinating that a man who is so hell-bent on saying you must have reason and facts and evidence has done so little work on finding facts and evidence.
Because this HistoryWiz.com, check it out, it's hilarious.
It makes Wikipedia look like an informed, reliable website, doesn't it?
I think it was last updated in 1998 or something, and it's steam-powered as a website.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is contradicted at every point by Wikipedia, which is by far, the more reliable on these facts, and nonetheless he's used HistoryWiz.com in order to talk about ancient mythologies and that sort of thing. But that's just made so ironic by the fact that he's come out saying, it's all about facts sweeping away mythology. It's all about, the facts of the matter, and evidence-based inquiry, just getting rid of religion and the old ways of thinking. We've got a clip of Richard Dawkins talking to Christian Guru Murphy on Channel 4 News recently, and just a couple of minutes of this clip really sets up why it is that his factual errors are just so hilarious. Let's have a look at Richard Dawkins talking to Christian Guru Murphy.
You'd want to change the world by ridding us of religion altogether?
Well, I would, but I think I generalise that to anything that's not evidence-based where factual knowledge is concerned. So I would also like to rid the world of superstition of all kinds. And things
astrology
like astrology and water divining and homeopathy and all sorts of things which are based on emotion and tradition, revelation, authority, rather than on evidence.
I mean, a lot of people would say you want to get rid of sort of anything that's based on feelings.
Well, I'm very fond of feelings where art is concerned and music is concerned, poetry is concerned. I'm deeply moved by great art, great poetry, great music. And that's fine, that's feelings, but that's not about what's factually true. So things that might or might not be factually true, there we need evidence and evidence only.
Why do you think that would make the world a better place?
Well, for one thing, because facts are so wonderful and scientific facts are so beautiful and elegant and such a treat for everyone, children especially perhaps, to understand. So to deprive children of the great knowledge that science has provided, especially in the 21st century now, is a great tragedy for them. But also, of course, because if you base your beliefs upon anything other than evidence, then it's very hard to change your mind. And so people who have been brought up to believe that it's the righteous and good thing to do, to, kill apostates, bomb buildings and things, it's very hard to sway them because they've been taught from childhood, this is right, this is just, this is what your God wants you to do. And so if they're not trained, if they don't subscribe to the view that evidence is what matters, then how are you going to change their mind?
You'd want to change the world by ridding us of religion altogether.
So that's basically Richard Dawkins saying facts, reason, evidence, reason, facts. But what's hilarious about that is, like, he wants to sweep religion from the face of the planet, whereas every bit of social science evidence is that religion is a force for good in the world. And, like, you know, even like recovery rates from operations and from cancer are markedly better for those who are, you know, religious. Life expectancy markedly better. Prosperity on every measure is, you know, the evidence is in Richard. Like, religion is a force for good in this world, but he doesn't really care about the facts.
No,
it's just a placard. Facts, evidence, reason, facts. Like, but only when they're on his side. Yeah. And so that's why we've called this week's episode, you know, feelings don't care about your facts, which is to reverse a famous saying of Ben Shapiro's, facts don't care about your feelings.
But it's worrying, isn't it, that many people will just pick up that book and they'll read what he says and go, this is truth. And even Christians will read through and just assume that bits he's saying is kind of this story here. You know, the Assyriologist was talking about, you know, the flood stories from Gilgamesh and all that kind of stuff. It'd be very easy as a Christian just to read that and take it at his word. Yeah. Because who honestly has got the time to Google every fact that gets mentioned in a book? Yeah,
that's why you go to History Whiz, guys. Yeah, Richard Dawkins didn't have the time, and he was getting paid to know about it.
But my question would be whether he knows he's doing that. Yeah. So is he doing it in ignorance or not? Because on the other side, because if he's doing it in ignorance, well, I mean, obviously that's just that's ignorance and stupidity. You should be better sourced if you're going to do that. And if he's doing it deliberately, well, I mean, he's not doing himself any favours. No. I mean, because equally you hear about kind of Christian. You heard that phrase, you know, lying for the Lord. No, you know, like Christians who kind of make up kind of like stories to like bolster the gospel. Yeah, you know, like some Jesus. Kind of miracle story or something that happened. They see, even though it wasn't really true, but they're like, well, we know God's real. Like, you're not actually doing yourself any favors by making stuff up.
Right. So anti-theist YouTube is constantly talking about this evangelist is lying for Jesus.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, but what about
Dawkins? Absolutely. So. Yeah, but interesting on the comments of that Guru Murthy interview, like so many people were just going like, he speaks with such clarity and truth, and I think, but he's talking nonsense. Yeah. And it's like the Stephen Fry, you know, the Stephen Fry clip on QI you talk about with Mithras. Yes. Where, you know, he's claiming that Christmas is based on old kind of Roman and Persian kind of gods and Mithras and all these things. And that's been thoroughly debunked. And it's ironic that he's doing that on a show which is supposed to debunk classic misunderstandings.
So, you know, feelings don't care about your facts, and I think it is that way around. I think, like, the human person ticks heart first, and then we justify things with our brains. You know, Jonathan Haidt in The Righteous Mind, he said that the mind... or rather, he says, like, the ego is not like an investigative journalist, like, doggedly seeking after the truth. The ego is like a press secretary for Donald Trump, right? The press secretary for Donald Trump just has to get out front and center, and whatever Donald Trump has been tweeting about that weekend, you've got to justify it, you know. But that's our egos. It's all good. But that's our egos. We are constantly trying to justify ourselves, and feelings don't care about your facts, even if you're Richard Dawkins and you trade in the language of facts, reason, evidence, reason, facts. So that's just fascinating. But I think the thing about Dawkins is 13 years ago the God Delusion came out, and I think Christians were running scared, thinking, the new atheism, it's going to eat us alive, and it's the new atheism that's been the blip. You know? We've moved on from that.
Absolutely.
You know, let's have a bit of courage that actually these forces that seem just so like they're going to sweep us away, like 13 years later, you know, Richard Dawkins is the laughingstock of so many atheists. So many atheists I talk to, they say I'm an atheist, but I'm not like Richard Dawkins.
He is the Independence Day 2.
Yeah.
No one cares.
So just hang on in there, guys. Hang on in there. Right, well, we need to meet our next intern. So last week we met Matthew Schaefer, who came all the way from Indianapolis in the States, sold up and moved over here. And over the course of the next 6 weeks, we're going to introduce you to our 6 different interns. We've had Matthew down there and in the middle at the bottom. And we've got Max from New Zealand, and we've got Nick, we've got Pete, we've got Benjamin, we've got Kezia. But what we really want to do is introduce to you Pete from Ipswich, all the way from Ipswich. This is not quite the most glamorous thing, you know. Last week we had crossing an ocean. What have you crossed in order to be with us, Pete?
Very slightly crossed the M25, Dartford crossing.
You've crossed the Dartford
We've crossed the
crossing.
Dartford
Yeah,
crossing.
That
Yeah.
can be very tricky. Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
That's
Indeed.
financial burden there, you know.
Yeah, we didn't quite sell our house. We just drove a couple of hours. But yeah,
Tell us about yourself, Pete.
sure. So, hello, internet. I'm Pete, 31, from Ipswich. I've been working as an evangelist for the last 3.5 years in East Ipswich. Absolutely love that. Just love sharing the gospel, sharing the good news, telling people about Jesus, and just jumped at the opportunity to come and do that as part of Speak Life's internship.
Terrific. Last week, Matthew brought us Matthew chapter 19 as a key verse that's helped him to process why it is that he wants to throw himself into this internship. Have you got some scriptures in mind as you think about why you're doing what you're doing?
Sure, yeah, just kind of piggybacking off of what Matthew was doing. So I'm going to 2 Corinthians 5. This is 2 Corinthians 5, verses 17 to 20. So it says this: Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old is gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us.
Great. And so what was it about those verses in particular that kind of struck you and made you want to bring them?
Well, specifically it's that word ambassador, isn't it? That word ambassador, because I think for me, I became a Christian in my early 20s, and I think throughout my kind of late teens and early 20s, one of the live issues for me was actually what should I be doing in my life? And I don't necessarily feel as though I can get away with referring to myself as a young person now, at 31. But certainly back then, I feel like what was live for me and for a lot of youngsters now is this idea of what are you going to do when you grow up? What are you going to do when you leave school, when you leave home? And actually for me, I think a more important question is actually, who are you?
Right.
Who are you? Because for me, I think when you know who you are, then it follows that you know what to do. And so for me, this verse really spoke for that specific reason, because it's very much paralleling those two ideas, isn't it? You know, you see this is who we are, and because this is who we are, then it follows that this is what we do.
So what is it about being an ambassador? Because I guess, like, when you think of an ambassador, you think of like the British ambassador to the United States, and you know, I guess you're on show at that point, and even your personal emails become, you know, picked over by other people, and everything you do at that stage is kind of seen in a different light because you're representing the whole time.
Sure.
Is that what it is that sort of spoke to you?
Well, I think part of it is, you know, you see in the text, you are now ambassadors, and so it's kind of like, well, I'm going to be one whether I applied for the job or not.
Right.
So I might as well try and be a good one, you know. And that's not reliant on me. You know, God makes the best of the little that we're holding out, of course. But I think for me, for so long, just searching for that purpose. What am I supposed to be doing in my life? And it was really answered ever so simply in you're supposed to represent. You're supposed to represent the King, and that's a great reason to get out of bed in the morning. So,
and for you then, I mean, if we think about being an ambassador and what that actually looks like, kind of in practice for every Christian, I suppose their context will be a bit different. It will look a bit different, but for you, kind of personally, what does it look like? Do you think to be an ambassador?
Good question. I think for me, it's kind of I kind of think of it as just being the baseline for everything else. And so that's not to say that I get it right all the time. There'll be probably more times that I've got it wrong than got it right. But you know, by God's grace, I'm convinced He still uses that for good. but for me, I'd kind of compare it to the difference between joy and happiness. And so, you know, if you're happy, that's fleeting in many ways. It can come and go. But if you're joyful, underneath that, regardless of whether you're happy or not, you've got that joy. And I kind of compare it to that. You know, I think if you've got a job, that can come and go. But if you've got a purpose, then that remains no matter what your job is or your situation or circumstance. So for me, I think it's just really about remembering that's the foundation for everything else.
I love in verse 20, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. I remember reading C.H. Spurgeon talking about how we are to have the same tone in imploring people to come to Christ as a lawyer would have if you were representing your best friend who was on trial for their life and they were going to be, you know, strung up on a gallows. If you couldn't implore the judge, you know, and that's the tone that you're meant to use. I mean, it's really heavy language. I wonder if I've ever preached like this. I wonder if I've ever preached, you know, when I preached Spurgeon.
Sure. Yeah, 100%. And for me, there's with that word implore, there's kind of this sense of your eloquence and your glamour kind of goes out the window because it's more like begging, isn't it? It's more like just please come home, just desperate. Yeah. And so there's a big challenge in that because we don't want to be undignified, do we? But,
right. Interesting. Well, Pete, thank you so much for coming and joining us, letting us know where you're coming from in all this. We've got a really exciting 10 months ahead. And if any of you guys want to join us here in the Speak Life Foundry, then we're going to be doing it again next year. And you can find out more about the Speak Life Foundry. Go to speaklifefoundry.com. If you want to find out more about the LIVEcast, go to speaklife.org.uk/cast. And there are ways that you can give towards this ministry. We exist because of the generosity of supporters like you guys. So go there, and it should be really easy to give there. And you can find links to our YouTube page, our Speak Life page, our Facebook page, and podcasts. You can pick this up as a podcast, as well as one other podcast that we do called Reading Between the Lines. But I reckon that will kind of do us.
And we now have Instagram.
Oh, yes.
Don't forget, if you're on Instagram, get over onto Instagram. We've had it for a long time, but we've just not been very good with it. Yeah. So you can follow us on there as well.
Terrific. And next week we'll be meeting another intern and finding out what it is that fires them up for the Foundry. But between now and then, God bless and keep speaking life.
Take care. We'll see you next time.